It was fun, like,
Great. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, students, if you need to sign in. You need to sign in. Pass it around. Yeah, we'll give you it. I don't know, we might have enough seats. Actually, yeah, can you guys find seats, possibly? Just so that there's... I think she's going to move around a little bit. Unimpeded viewing. Yes, unimpeded viewing, that's right. That's what we're looking for. Welcome, everyone. All right. Well, welcome. This actually isn't the first independent senior project this year. If any of you went to Rent on Friday and Saturday night a couple of weeks ago, that was the first ISP. Amelia, you just came in just in time. But most independent senior projects happen in the spring. But the way that Josie's schedule worked out, it worked better in the winter. And so, without further ado, I present Joscie Norris and her poetry, printing, and painting. Enjoy.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming today. Shortly after the start of winter term, I walked into a maintenance shop and asked for a man with a chainsaw. Jeff Kalusha said, "We love chainsaws." And Steve said, "I've got one. When?" Then took a double look and asked if I had a reason. I'd like it stuck. Here's me. I grew up in Roxbury, bushwhacking through the forests, building forts, scrambling over rocky ridges, and ice skating on mossy swamps. My family traveled to rural coastlines, farmtown Vermont, and mountain peaks. These places are the experiences I carry with me, and despite my attempts to mute the unconventional side of me, I cannot shake my obsession with some of these raw locations. You should understand that many of my relatives are fine carpenters and skilled fiber artists. Part of my fascination with working with my hands extends from a genetic intuition. But my creative side is more complicated than just being an artist or having talent. When I was 2, I became sick with lead poisoning from dust paint in my living environment. In first grade, I was diagnosed with a learning disability, often referred to as dyslexia, making elementary school defeating. I have weak symbol imagery and weak linear analysis, which leads to my struggles in subjects like spelling and math. Based on research, I believe that this disability is a result of the poisoning when my brain was still developing. This makes me a strong right-brained thinker with shortcomings. I'm someone who is particularly adept with creative thought, handiwork, three-dimensional understanding, and connecting concepts. In Litchfield County Times, March 2013, an article was published on a local artist, Brian Nash Gill, who made relief prints of woodcuts. His stunning work stayed with me for its detail and rawness of the concentric rings and complex three-dimensional history. When I was frantically searching Pinterest for inspiration, I considered how relevant his creations were to my art and values. I have learned that some of the best creativity comes from having a loose structure. So for my ISP, I chose to create a portfolio of work themed place while focusing on the process. Focusing on just one way that focusing on just one art or writing form seemed too narrow. So I connected 3 of my main passions: poetry, printing, and painting. From 20 of my best poems, I have printed 3 broadsides this term. Some of these places I write about are invented, but in all cases these creations are formed by the places that have made up my experiences. For each broadside design, without giving away the story, I have illustrated captivating details from each poem. I'd like to read you one poem today. This one here. Glen. The daylight is not what we think. It drains the black from between the stars, and behind the glow they begin their fall, so each ember melts into blue. It's bleak, this time when gems vanish to show us these habitual colors of the sky, when drugged bees drone out of their hives. We stumble on in silence. Don't touch the red fawns lying still in the thicket, or the foxes mittened in their den. And if your trifles are what deny you shelter, linger with us. Rest each foot patiently beside the ambering caps of little mushrooms, and breathe steam into the gray air, until the greatest witnesses whisper to us in the spruce forest light. For the Glen printing, Steve with his chainsaw took me down to the brush pile, a place outdoors affectionately calls the stump dump. I picked out 5 log sections that he cut into slabs. One of them is up here, for example. My 4 years at Westover has become my backbone, specifically my outdoors experiences. Therefore, the maple trees I repurposed were from Chapel and Quad. These historic landmarks are in many ways the faces of Westover. With the help of my dad and Olivia Senna, I sanded, burned with a propane torch, scrubbed and shellacked the stump faces. So here's a video example of how we processed the faces of the stumps. The burning eats away at the soft spring wood and leaves behind prominent summer growth rings. And then over here in the corner, she's scraping away the ash. Using a brayer, I covered the stumps with a mix of colors, then carefully placed a piece of thick paper over the wood. I tried to rub with my fingers to get an impression, but the friction burned my fingers. But my hands became raw. I tried rubbing with a metal spoon, but the friction burned my fingertips. Finally, I pulled an acorn out of my pocket and began slowly rubbing with that, and it worked. When I peeled away the paper, I found these images, here and over there. Maybe because the wood was cold or because I did not char deep enough, my cuts resulted in a captivating, cracked pattern, revealing different stories and characters than Brian's work. I also was given a piece of the old senior apple tree that had been cut from Quad because of disease, and the stump became one of my favorite prints, reminding me of Moss or Westover's pond. And so here's one of my favorite pieces that came from that. Although there are imperfections, these fingerprints are an oral history of the trees. Decay, hollows, knots, and cuts show where insects, storms, people, weather, and other influences changed the tree's structure. Once I had all of these stumps, I realized the poem was about my Westover. I knew the art and writing fit well together, but the details I drew upon in this poem unconsciously came from my time at Westover's Woods Pond. I chose an image of feathers for my poem, Learning About Gravity, which is about how life and loss close in on space and time, grounding us. And that piece is kind of in the middle back over there. In setting type, I structured my poem to add a feeling of weight and falling like a bird I had rescued when I was younger. For my poem Tides, I based the image off of many oceanic locations. I used an image of blue crabs and a nighttime shoreline to show attachment and detachment between space. Tides and Gravity were poems I wrote last year with Paul and Tom. I continued to revise them with Mr. Coffin and submitted them to poetry competitions as part of my project. Writing poetry is something that I have developed an individual voice for, of description and alliteration during my time at Westover. Many of my poems are based on memories in which I recreate the atmosphere and landscape around me and focus on the emotional and scientific connections between people and the environment. Unlike the stumps, these images were carved into linoleum rubber blocks and printed on Claire, Westover's Vandercook SP20 printing press. Next, I set my poems with small pieces of lead type in a composing stick and placed the lines in a metal tray called a galley. So, here's the galley right in here. Or here's the galley right here that the type was set into. Mostly I use a font called Bedoni in size 12 or 14. Setting type is technical, frustrating, and time-consuming, often taking up to 4 hours for one poem. Sometimes I would run short just one letter for a whole poem. Other times I would use lowercase l's instead of capital I's and have to pull them out with itty-bitty tweezers. Ironically, I'm pretty quick at setting type. Most people associate dyslexia with the flipping of B's and D's, which is not something I struggle with. Because the type is three-dimensional, I am able to organize it in my brain and tactically order it in the proper way, right to left and backwards. Then I tightened the poems up in the bed of the printing press with pieces of wood called furniture, and ran proofs to check for spelling errors, upside-down letters, and funky spacing. One afternoon, it took me 5 hours to proof just one poem and get the ink and impression to the exact science. And this was my first time printing independently. So here's a video I wanted to show of a print we did probably a couple of years back in the letterpress room and how the printing press works. So you put the paper in at the top and then you roll it through, and in the bed of the press here is where the type is, and then at the end the paper will come out with the words or the image on it. So that's Joe Rydell, Joe as we call him, who's been helping the letterpress collective for many years. Ordering paper was difficult because there are hundreds of different materials, thicknesses, texture, color, and size options. Tom Juvan, my printing advisor, was instrumental in helping me choose my supplies and simplify my designs. Even mixing the color of the ink was challenging. I'd weigh different percents of the rubber-based ink, then mix the ink with a palette knife. Test the color and add more ink to make subtle adjustments. I found mixing ink for the monoprints to be a very difficult science from painting with oils or watercolor. The ink is thick, rich, and takes forever to dry. I found my mistakes to be most fascinating, although some were infuriating. At the end of a weekend, the printing studio would be wall-to-wall with newsprint proofs in different colors. The ink often smudged or came out uneven, like for most of my gravity prints over there. The stumps showed sanding marks and rips in the paper from the pressure. During the end of my project, the collective was printing a first floor blueprint engraving of Westover. Through layering, I used this historic image to tie my pieces back to my experiences here at Westover. Sometimes I would double print on a sheet of paper while making an adjustment to end up with this repetitive pattern. Those are the images at the very end of the wall. As the designer, these mistakes and experiences allowed me to add another dimension to my work. The final part of the process was to add overlaying effects of watercolor paint and drawings to my prints. Because printing limits the layering and experimental freedom I have, I added sketches and touches of color, maps, writing, and drippings to expand the breadth of my work. I went into this term blind and baffled by what I wanted to do. I love art, but it is not something I entirely enjoy on its own. I love the process of making art. Hunting for materials at dusk in the woods, burning stumps outside in a blizzard, collaborating with incredible friends and teachers, reading poetry in the boathouse, days printing in solitude, listening to Spotify, hearing different perspectives, and buying art supplies. The journal I have kept of this process shows much progression because of the loose structure of this project that has offered me broad creativity. It also shows how many times I had to simplify or save some of my ideas for later. This project has captured many passions through place that I will hold on to, not only in its physical work, but through this experience. After March break, my work will be shown in the Schumacher Gallery, and in late spring I may sell some of these pieces. I would like to give a special thanks to Kate Truini and Tom Juvan for being the backbone of this project, and Mr. Coffin, Leah, Allie, Caleb, Sarah, and Inky Joe for all of their knowledge and support. Thank you Ben, Steve, Jeff, Emma, Olivia, Brianna, the rest of the Letterpress Collective, and my family for all of your help. You have made this term very meaningful for me. I encourage you to take a moment to look at the work and materials I have out on display to gain a fuller understanding of how this work was made. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions that I can answer?
Where are the slabs now? Will you save those?
Yes, I will save them. They're actually kind of beautiful as they are. One of them is up here, and I ended up changing it a little bit by adding some carvings into it, which you can see in this print here. I'm not sure what I'll do with them next, but I will save them.
When's your first workshop?
There will be a letterpress class this spring, so I think that's the next step for the printing studio.
You said you particularly loved some mistakes that you made as you sort of went along with learning from the mistakes. Were there any mistakes that you felt were particularly fortuitous that sort of ended up being part of what you were deciding it was actually, that was meant to be?
Yeah, well, so one of the things, I don't know if it was a mistake, but it just happened that this was the print of the apple tree, and I was expecting the prints to come out kind of like the artist's work, where the rings were really prominent, and they weren't. They were really cracked. And that just came from when we burned the stump, it cracked immensely. And that was just kind of luck. That was the nature of the stump. But that was something that I think did something different that it needed. Other prints, when I was printing them by hand, they'd get really smudgy like this one. And I just loved the effect of that, how it was very airy. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you guys.
Can you do, like now that you've worked with this letterpress, do you feel like you could come across another one and do something similar, or are all letterpresses, their own beast?
They're, I would assume, very different. We worked with one, we went to Yale in the fall or last year, I forget when, in the fall, and that was a completely different press. It's completely structured differently. It was a much older press. It wasn't electric. And that I had no idea how to use, but they walked us through it. So I think the idea of how you would set up your work initially, setting the type, carving the image, they're all going to be the same height, so that I could do. But operating each press, it's kind of scary because they're antiques and they're so beautiful. So I'd love to learn how to use more of them. Well, thank you so much. And like I said, there's examples of work.